Welcome to Selling to K-12 School Meals Programs, Understanding Your Customers' Needs and Regulations. I'm Rosie Kruger with the Vermont Agency of Education Child Nutrition Programs.
And I'm Abby Nelson with Vermont Food Education Every Day, a statewide farm-to-school project of Vermont, of NOFA Vermont and Shelburne Farms. And this is the first part of a two-part webinar series, primarily focused for farmers and producers. The change in nutritional and procurement guidelines offers some great opportunities for farmers and producers. However, rather than the informal, often non-committal agreements from years before, there are additional rules and systems in place that schools need to adhere to. In these two webinars, Rosie and I hope to clarify briefly what the new regulations and guidelines are and how to work with them from the farmer's point of view. We will be focusing in this part on understanding the marketing opportunities that exist in school meal programs. And we'll talk about some of the regulations that these programs need to follow. The second part of the webinar series will focus more in depth on school procurement requirements, local purchasing, how school meal programs may be defining the goals of their farm-to-school programs, and how you, as a local producer, can market yourself to meet those needs.
So I'm going to start today by talking a little bit about the different school meals programs that the schools that you sell to might operate. We have the National School Lunch Program, the School Breakfast Program, the After School Snack Program, and the Summer Food Service Program. The best known of these programs is the National School Lunch Program. Schools participating in this program receive federal and state funds for each reimbursable meal served. So that's every student lunch that meets certain nutritional requirements. On average, schools receive about $2.70 per lunch served. And then on top of that, they also receive about 30 cents worth of USDA foods, which are formerly known as commodity foods, for each lunch served. And we've been working really hard in recent years to increase the quality and choice that schools have with regard to those USDA foods. So schools have approximately $3 per meal to produce the lunches that they serve. And that includes labor, benefits, equipment servicing, and sometimes indirect costs like trash hauling. There are a bunch of other school meals programs that schools have the option to operate, and those include the School Breakfast Program, the After School Snack Program, and the Summer Food Service Program. The reimbursement rates for those programs are much lower than the lunch program. So for example, for the After School Snack Program, the reimbursement rate is only about 82 cents per snack served. We don't have really good figures on the total food spending in Vermont, but we know that independently operated school meals programs in Vermont, so those that do not use food service management companies, they spend approximately $15 million per year on food and supplies. So we can see that it is a potentially a big market, and also that school meals programs are really operating on a pretty tight budget to produce the meals that they serve. There are a couple other school food markets. One of these is the Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Program, so schools with a free and reduced percentage of 40% or higher, and that's students who receive free and reduced price lunch. So free and reduced percentage of 40% or higher are able to apply for a fresh fruit and vegetable grant to participate in the Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Program. Schools use this grant to serve a fresh fruit or vegetable snack sometime during the day, not at breakfast or lunch. And the goal of this program is to expose students to a variety of fresh produce that they haven't experienced before. I want to highlight this program in particular as an opportunity for local producers because food service managers purchasing for this purpose may be looking for really unique fruits and vegetables such as multicolored carrots or Asian pears, but they will generally be looking to purchase each item just a few times during the year, not purchasing the same items each week, so that they're able to expose students to a larger variety of produce. And many schools look to purchase produce for this program locally and may conduct the purchasing for this program separately from the rest of their purchases. So if you're not a particularly large producer and you don't have the volume to sustain a school's supply of a particular item throughout the whole year, the Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Program may still be a good potential marketing opportunity for you. Another way of supplying produce to schools is through the DoD Fresh program. Schools are allowed to request up to 100% of their USDA foods, those are those commodity foods that I mentioned earlier, in the form of fresh produce. And USDA has an arrangement with the Department of Defense to contract with regional produce distributors across the country to meet this need. In Vermont, Reinhardt Food Service has the contract to supply this program, and we're already able to offer a few Vermont products through this program. And I'll talk a little bit more later about how specifically to get your produce sold through this program. That's an opportunity more for larger produce vendors versus DoD versus the fresh fruit and vegetable program, which could be a good fit for both small and large produce vendors. Schools may also be purchasing products to sell outside of the federally sponsored school meals program. Many high schools and some middle schools sell additional a la carte items in addition to the reimbursable meals at lunch and breakfast. And these items do not qualify for reimbursement, so students pay for them fully. And some schools rely on a la carte sales like cookies or chips or beverages to make extra money to support their meals programs. In addition, some schools may sell food and beverages to students through vending machines, through the school store, or through fundraisers. So they may be looking to purchase food that they'll sell through those venues. I mentioned that schools only receive the reimbursement funds from the federal and state government if they meet certain nutritional requirements. So I'm going to spend a little more time talking about these requirements as they relate to you so that you can think about how your products could meet these requirements. I'm not going to cover every requirement today, just the ones that seem relevant to you as vendors. So keep in mind that the school food service manager that you're working with when they purchase your products is also juggling a lot of other requirements that we're not going to talk about today. Under the new meal pattern that was instituted by the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act of 2011, schools need to meet these requirements for a meal to be considered reimbursable. They have to offer and students have to take minimum amounts of fruits and vegetables each week they have to offer vegetables from a variety of color subgroups. There are minimum serving sizes for meats and meat alternates and for grain items. And there are no longer maximum serving sizes for these items, but if schools go too far over the minimum size, they risk going over the weekly fat and sodium limits. All grain items must be at least 50% whole grain, and there are weekly sodium limits which are set to get stricter over the next several years. So we're going to go a little more in depth into each of those areas now. In the area of fresh fruits and vegetables, schools are really looking for products in half-cup serving sizes. And this is because at breakfast, the program needs to offer students a full cup of fruit, but the student must take only at least a half cup of fruit for the meal to be reimbursable. And this means that the program needs to have enough fruit available for each student that they expect to feed to be able to take a full cup, but often the students will only take a half cup. And this means that schools want to offer the fruit in half cup portions so that less food goes to waste if the students didn't want the full cup. At lunch, K-8 programs need to offer a half cup of fruit and 3/4 of a cup of vegetables, and students need to take a half cup of either fruits or vegetables. For 9 through 12 programs, they have to offer a full cup of fruit and a full cup of vegetables, and students need to only take a half cup total. So you don't need to remember any of that, but what you do want to remember is that if you were a fruit or vegetable producer, you should know that schools are looking to purchase all of these items in half cup portions. USDA has a buying guide that schools use when they're planning their menus that shows what a half cup portion for a variety of different products would be, and you can use that to figure out what this means for your product. We're going to post a link to this buying guide. It is here in the slideshow, but we'll post a link when we post the webinar. You can also find the buying guide just simply by searching USDA Food Buying Guide for Schools. For example, a 125 to 138 count whole apple, if you looked it up in the buying guide, would count as a 1 cup of fruit. A 100 count apple counts as more than that. It counts as 1 1/4 cup of fruit, which is much more than the program needs to serve. So your school food service manager is probably not going to be looking to purchase 100 count apples. They're more likely to be looking to purchase 125 or 138 count apples. To meet that 1 cup requirement. And if you had even smaller apples than that, they would potentially be even more excited about that. For pears, a 150 count pear is a half a cup of fruit, and that's perfect. But a 100 count pear counts as a 1 1/4 cup of fruit, and that's too much. If you're doing any kind of fresh cut products or preparing and packaging produce items for schools, you're going to want to make sure to keep that half cup increment in mind as well. So if you're preparing carrots or apples or anything, you would want to make sure that the prepared portion was a half cup. Programs are also required to serve a certain variety of vegetable subgroups each week. So they're no longer able to serve French fries and ketchup every day and call that a vegetable. And they haven't been able to do that for a pretty long time. Over the course of the week, they need to serve a half cup of dark green vegetables, a half cup of legumes or peas or beans, a half cup of starchy vegetables, and 3/4 to 1 1/4 cup of red orange vegetables, and a half cup of other vegetables. And we do have a slide here, I think, in a minute that shows the different vegetable subgroups. Here we go. Yeah. Many schools are relying heavily on fruit and veggie bars to meet these requirements because they're able to put as long as they put the appropriate quantities of vegetable subgroup onto the fruit and veggie bar, it doesn't matter what combination each kid takes as long as they have a half cup total. So the school is able to offer all the different subgroups that they need to offer, but they don't have to be watching the volume of vegetable subgroups that each student is taking. So yeah, this is that list that shows you what the different color subgroups are, and you can again find this again by Googling it, USDA fruit and vegetable subgroups, or vegetable subgroups. There are no fruit subgroups. Okay, going further into when it comes to buying processed fruit and vegetable items, schools are still looking for items in half cup serving sizes or items that can make up a half cup serving size. For example, a 1/4 cup serving of salsa could be paired with other vegetables on a taco bar. I mentioned before that the sodium limits are slated to decrease over the next several years, so schools are generally looking for low sodium items. So if you're making veggie chips or salsa or some other item with added salt, you'll want to make sure that you keep your school food service version low in sodium, and at a minimum you're going to want to have a nutrition label that indicates the amount of sodium in the product. If there are other ingredients in the processed items other than a single fruit or vegetable, it makes life much easier for the school if there is a product formulation statement or a CN label that tells the school how much fruit or vegetable that product credits for in their menu. And the product formulation statement and a CN label are both tools created by USDA that allow a manufacturer to tell the school this information rather than the food service manager having to calculate it. So, for example, the USDA Food Buying Guide actually tells schools how to calculate how much generic tomato sauce to serve to count as a half cup of red orange vegetable. But if you're producing a tomato sauce that has a lot of mushrooms and green peppers in it, then it could also count towards the other subgroup of vegetables if you create a product formulation statement or get a USDA-approved CN label that shows that. But the food service manager without those statements or labels would not be able to credit it for those other subgroups. When we post the recording of this presentation on the Vermont Feed website, we'll post a handout that gives more information on creating product formulation statements. And I want to reiterate, those are not needed for fresh produce or for items that do not contain multiple ingredients. This would only be for processed fruit and vegetable items or other items that included multiple ingredients. Okay, moving on to grains. So like those half cup serving sizes for fruits and vegetables, schools must meet minimum portion sizes for the grain category. The minimum portion sizes in this category are 1 or 2 ounce equivalents depending on the age group of the kids. The ounce equivalent measurement can get a little confusing. I actually find it very confusing. It's important to remember that a 2-ounce muffin does not have 2 ounces of flour or grain in it. It also has eggs, sugar, leavening, oil, maybe some fruit or nuts. So if we needed to offer a 2-ounce equivalent of grain in our muffin, the muffin would have to be larger than 2 ounces. We're looking for how much, if there's 2 ounces of flour basically in that product. So schools are generally looking for grain products in exactly 1 ounce or 2 ounce equivalent sizes so that they're meeting those requirements, again, without serving more than they're required to, because if they did that, they'd be increasing potential costs and waste. All this stuff, again, is a ton of work for food service managers to keep track of. So again, just like with those processed fruit and vegetable items, they're looking for products that have product formulation statements or CN labels that certify how many ounce equivalents of grain are contained in each serving. If you've completed a product formulation statement and it's approved by USDA, you want to make sure to advertise this to your potential school customers, along with advertising how many ounce equivalents each serving of your item supplies. So that's the product formulation statement. In addition, this year for whole grain, for grain items, starting this year, 100% of the grain items served to students need to be whole grain rich. So this means that they are made with at least 50% whole grain flour by weight, and any non-whole grain flour must be enriched. The one stumbling block that we've run into recently in this area is that USDA does not consider sifted flour, so that's flour with some but not all of the germ removed, to be enriched. And a number of local bakeries in Vermont do use a locally produced sifted flour in their products, and so far we've been unable to convince USDA that these should be allowed as an alternative to an enriched flour. So for now, schools cannot use products that contain sifted flours. If you're a bakery, you'll want to make sure that any flour in your product that is not whole grain is enriched flour. But there's a lot of confusion about that whole grain requirement. It does not mean that schools are required to serve items that are 100% whole grain. It's 100% of items served need to be whole grain rich, which means that they're at least 50% whole grain. I've mentioned the sodium requirements already, but these are something to remember when it comes to bread products as well. And like with the other processed products, if you're selling baked items to schools, they will need a nutritional label that says how much sodium is included per serving. And then in addition, if there are any sugar or other sweeteners in your product, they should only be a minor ingredient. Breads or other baked goods that contain sugar as the first ingredient cannot be served in programs. So for meats and meat alternates, this category includes red meat, poultry, eggs, fish, beans, dairy, nuts, and seeds. Schools are also required to serve minimum ounce equivalents for meats and meat alternates, and like with bread products, a 1 ounce meat item might not have a full ounce of meat in it. So a 1 ounce sausage patty might have spices and fillers like soy protein or cornmeal, so that the sausage patty needs to be a little larger than 1 ounce to count as a 1 ounce equivalent, because you're really looking for the 1 ounce of meat in the product. You don't care about the whole size of the product. So again, schools are looking for meat alternate products in exactly 1 ounce or 2 ounce equivalent sizes to reduce both their costs and potential waste. And again, vendors can complete product formulation statements for products in this category. If you're just applying pure ground beef and the schools are making a hamburger patty themselves, then you wouldn't need to worry about a product formulation statement. But if you're making a preformed beef patty, you'll at least want to make sure that they're the right size so that the cooked product counts as a 1 or 2 ounce serving. And if you're adding other ingredients to the product, then you'll want to make sure to consider doing a product formulation statement or a CN label.
So Rosie, just as a confirmation, we have a question. And I know you mentioned it, but perhaps you can reiterate it. The caller wants to know, is it 1 ounce or 2 ounce servings of prepared weight or raw weight for meat or grains? Could you just restate that?
Sure. So it's prepared weight. So in the case of that sausage patty, we're not looking at the amount of raw pork or raw ground meat that's in that sausage patty. We care about the prepared weight after all that fat has cooked out. Good question. Okay, so outside of the school meals programs, schools are also looking for those we mentioned earlier, products to sell as a la carte items or outside of the school meals program. So starting this year, schools that operate the National School Lunch Program must also follow the new Smart Snack regulations for foods that compete with reimbursable meals. So this includes other items sold by the School Food Service Program during breakfast or lunch that are not part of the reimbursable meal, so that, those cookies, chips, extra beverages, or standalone entrees. Food sold through vending machines, fundraisers, any food sold through school stores or anywhere else on campus during the school day. The rules only apply to foods and beverages sold during the school day, and USDA defines that by midnight the night before to 30 minutes after the end of the school day. And they only apply to foods sold to students. So stuff sold after school at sports games or stuff sold just to teachers, like a vending machine in the teacher's lounge, would be exempt. But basically anything else that is sold to students that could compete with that reimbursable meal has to meet certain nutritional regulations now. And you can see in this box, we've got some links here for how to find out what those regulations are and how to see if your product qualifies. But I can tell you that because of the new rules, many schools are really looking hard for snack and beverage and fundraising options that do meet the new requirements, because they do rely on those items to bring in revenue for the school, for their programs. So this is an area where you can see in the picture here, we've got 2 Vermont products that do meet those requirements, and that schools are serving in order to meet those needs for those competitive foods. All right.
Okay, so always a concern with school meal programs is food safety, and schools may ask for food safety measures, which are not required by the USDA. There's no specific food safety certifications, but USDA does require that school meal programs have their own HACCP, and that's Hazardous Analysis of Critical Control Points plans. These plans may specify food safety measures that vendors need to follow. So in other words, the HACCP plans schools will always have, and they may ask if the vendor, meaning the farmer or producer, has them as well. But the USDA does not require that. And why are they good? Well, young children are at a higher risk for foodborne illness than the general population. So it's important that school meal programs can be sure that the products they purchase have been handled properly. We encourage schools to think about what food safety assurances they need and balance that with the knowledge that stricter food safety requirements, such as requiring GAP or Good Agricultural Practice certification, or even very high levels of insurance, will mean that some smaller producers and farmers are unable to compete.
And Abby, we are getting a question in asking if HACCP plans are required for farmers.
No, as I said, they aren't required, but it is important that the farmer or producer ask the food service director what their school requires. It may be a district rule, it could be an individual school rule. So it's important to find that out before talking about products.
And just to clarify, so USDA doesn't require that the farmer has a HACCP plan, but the school has is certainly allowed to require that.
Yes.
And do you want to talk a little bit about this checklist?
Oh, yes. Here? And so this checklist that was created by UVM Extension here in Vermont, and what this is a one-page form that a food service director can use to have a conversation or an interview with a farmer. And it's looking at just some basic food safety measures on the farm, from growing to harvesting to packing to delivering. And they're not intimidating questions, and most farmers follow these anyway, so a food service director should not be worried about asking, and farmers should be happy, I would hope, to explain their food safety measures on their farm, because certainly farmers and producers care about the safety of their customers. So we will have this available along with the other links on the Vermont Feed website.
Sure. And we have given this particular handout to schools and let them know that these are some good questions to ask if they're going to be purchasing produce direct or other products directly from farms.
Okay, so now that we know what products schools are looking to purchase, we're going to briefly talk about how they purchase them. And here's a list of ways your products might end up in school programs. They might come on a distributor's truck, and that could also include a food hub, might be direct sales, growing contracts, DoD Fresh that Rosie mentioned before, some schools in a pinch will buy from grocery stores, although we don't recommend it. And these all must be competitively procured. So in the past, Vermont schools have been encouraged to purchase local products by finding a local farmer or producer and developing a relationship with them. This has led to lots of local products appearing on Vermont school lunch menus. Vermont's a leader in the farm-to-school movement, in fact. However, it often depends on altruism on the part of producers who are asked to sell their products at a lower price to schools, and it's not a competitive system. The school develops relationships with one or two farmers, but other farmers in the area don't have a chance to compete for the school's business and don't necessarily know it's even an opportunity. This personal relationship way of doing farm to school is actually also in violation of the federal regulations for school meals program. It's not that the relationship is in violation, but it's the way business has been done. USDA regulations require that school meal programs use competitive procurement for all purchases they make when they're using the federal meal program funds. Generally, for purchases under $15,000 in Vermont, this means checking prices for the product or service in 3 places and going with the lowest price of a responsive and responsible vendor. For larger purchases, schools need to follow a formal procurement process and go out to bid. And we're going to go over these regulations in much more detail in the second part of the webinar series. We've never enforced this regulation, particularly the informal bidding regulation in Vermont, or provided training on it. So many school meal programs aren't aware the requirement existed for years. However, USDA has asked the State Agency of Education to start reviewing schools' procurement practices starting next school year. So we have been doing trainings for school food service managers around the state. Some of the feedback we've heard from these managers at these trainings is they're concerned that the farmers and producers that they've been doing business with will be confused or even insulted once they're asked for prices so that they can conduct a competitive procurement process. So one of the goals of these 2 webinars is to educate you as a farmer or producer about what the process looks like and point out some areas and ways that Vermont producers can be competitive in this process and still get school business. USDA requires competitive procurement to ensure that schools are getting the best possible product at the lowest possible price when they're spending taxpayer dollars, and also to ensure that vendors all have a fair opportunity to compete for those taxpayer dollars. There are lots of ways that local producers can stand out and be competitive during this process, and we're going to talk about all of that in the second part of this webinar series.
So changing gears a little bit, I am going to talk a little bit about selling through DoD Fresh because I mentioned that earlier. And that is one of the other ways that schools get produce into their programs aside from going out and doing their own competitive procurements. So through this program, schools can spend their USDA foods dollars on fresh product, and that's that extra 30 cents of in-kind food that schools receive for each meal served. DoD does stand for the Department of Defense. DoD purchases a large amount of fresh produce every day all over the country to supply all their military bases. So as a result, they've got all the contracting systems in place to conduct these purchases, and USDA has an agreement with DoD to also conduct the contracting for fresh produce purchases for schools through this program. So in Vermont, as I said earlier, Reinhart Food Service has the contract to be the DoD Fresh distributor, and this means that Reinhart is responsible for sourcing the produce and delivering it to the schools when they order it, which can be as often as once per week. DoD encourages Reinhart to source local produce for this program, but DoD checks the pricing every week and won't allow Reinhart to offer anything that is priced significantly higher than USDA's terminal market pricing for our region. So we've been working with Reinhart to source local apples, local potatoes, and local squash through this program already, but we're really interested in wanting to add more local products. So if you would like to be a supplier for this program, you would need to meet Reinhart's insurance and food safety requirements, and you would need to have pricing that is competitive with the domestic terminal market pricing for that product when in season. And that's a USDA resource that you can find easily online by searching USDA market news terminal market pricing.
Oh, so Rosie, we have a question. Do the products for the DoD Fresh program have to all be whole products, or is it possible that some of the produce could be minimally processed, meaning cut up?
So it all has to be fresh product, but we can accept minimally processed product. So no dried or juiced products. I did try requesting cider, and DoD turned me down on that. They wouldn't allow me to request cider. But carrot sticks, cut carrot sticks, cut celery sticks.
Cut up roasted roots?
Not roasted, but cut up vegetables to be roasted. Yes,
exactly.
That would be acceptable.
So not cooked.
Yeah.
Got it.
So the way that process works, we at the state level have to request the product from DoD. DoD turns around and requests it from the vendor, which is Reinhardt. Reinhardt sources it and supplies their pricing to DoD. DoD approves the pricing, and then the product gets listed. So we as a state kind of drive the products that are listed in that catalog.
Mm-hmm. And will Reinhardt Food Service always be the ones that are dealing with this DoD Fresh?
That's another competitive procurement process that DoD handles. So Reinhardt was recently awarded that contract, I believe, for a 3-year term, although I'm not entirely sure of the details of that. But after that term expired, then DoD would go out to bid again for that. So if this is something you're interested in learning more about, please send me an email, and my contact information, I believe, is on the next slide. And indeed, it is actually not. My contact information is a little further along. This slide, we get a lot of questions from producers about how do I know who the schools are, how do I contact them directly. So there is a list of public schools and private schools that can be found on the Vermont Agency of Education website, and that has contact information for at least the principal at each school. You might have to do a little more digging or call the school directly to find the food service manager. And then the Food Directors Association is a buying club that conducts procurement on behalf of many independently operated school food service authorities. And they are very interested in working with local producers to come up with, to do some procurement on behalf of schools in Vermont. So their contact information is there. Bob Clifford and Doug Davis, we're both school food service directors. And then there are a number of food service management companies that have contracts with Vermont schools to produce their meals, and those companies may conduct procurement on behalf of those schools. So those are the Abbey Group, Cafe Services, Fitzvote, and Sodexo.
And what I've noticed, Rosie, around the state is that all of these folks are very interested in carrying local product. And so no farmer or producer should shy away because they have a lot of different categories of foods to fulfill.
Sure, yes, that's a good point. And just to point out, these are not the only food service management companies that are allowed in Vermont. These are just the ones that currently have contractors with schools. So here finally is our contact information, and you should feel free to reach out to either Abby or myself or Lori Colgan, who is my boss, to ask us any questions that you have about serving schools or appealing or marketing to schools. We hope this has been useful, and again, feel free to reach out or read the resources that are on the Vermont Feed website that go along with this. And make sure to watch part 2 of this webinar series, which will go much more in depth into how you as a local producer can stand out when a school is doing a competitive procurement process.
Thank you.